Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie for Reason TV. Today we're talking with Judge Andrew Napolitano, author of the new book, Lies the Government Told You, Myth, Power, and Deception in American History. Judge, thanks for talking.
Pleasure to be with you, Nick, whether we're talking about my book or anything.
Why did you write this book?
Because the thing that impressed me the most when I was on the bench as a judge hearing arguments between the government and a defendant in a criminal case, or the government and someone who had been injured by the government in a civil case, was the extent to which the government would lie and people in the courtroom, members of the jury, lawyers involved in the case would expect the government to lie. You know, there are at least a half dozen Supreme Court opinions that say the government can lie.
Tell us what's one of them.
Well, the context in which the government may lie is when it's interrogating a potential defendant. The classic modern-day example is Martha Stewart. She's with an FBI agent. They're in her lawyer's office. The lawyer says to the FBI agent, "Is my client a target?" The FBI agent says no. The FBI agent then says to Martha Stewart, "Did you buy such and such a stock on such and such a day?" She says no. They each lied. She went to jail for 5 months and he got a promotion.
That's right.
Well, what is it about the government? Are they morally superior to us that they can lie with impunity, lie with the law behind them, and if one of us would presume to do it to them, we could end up in jail? The government has institutionalized lying. From all men are created equal, hard for me to attack that because it was written by my hero and favorite president, Thomas Jefferson, to we don't torture, and about 15 or 16 significant historical lies in between. When I kiddingly told friends I was writing a book about the government lying, and it was 4,000 pages long, many of them said, "You got all the lies in 4,000 pages?" Obviously, it's not 4,000 pages, it's 300. But it shows you how acculturated we are to the concept of government lying.
Let's talk about some of the specific lies that you run through. You say one of the lies is, "We don't torture." How is that a lie, and what is destructive, not just about the torture perhaps, but the lying?
Almost all government lying is destructive because it induces people to view the government in a false environment. Some lies, like LBJ in 1964, I'm the peace candidate, or FDR in 1940, your boys will never fight a war on foreign soil, or George Bush in 2004, we don't torture, I'm not spying, and they have weapons of mass destruction. Those are the category of lies that induce us to give power to the government based on those lies. Question, would we have given that power to the government had we known the truth? The "we don't torture" is particularly offensive. A, it's incorrect, it's a lie, and the person who said it, President Bush, must have known that it was a lie because we now have documents that we know he saw in which he authorized torture. B, it's particularly horrific because it rejects the notion that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. If a government presumes to torture someone, they reject the notion of inalienable rights.
Some people would say that, well, you know, we don't torture American citizens. Why, from your point of view, does it not matter if we're torturing non-citizens or Americans?
This morning, the Washington Post reported that the CIA announced that it will target Americans when they're overseas for assassination. So it's obvious that being an American is no additional protection. But as a matter of constitutional law, the Constitution protects persons. It's not limited to Americans, and persons is not even limited to good persons. It protects Americans, it protects aliens, it protects those legally here, it protects those illegally here, it protects those who wish us well and those who have caused us harm. It makes no distinction whatsoever. This is absolutely consistent, the constitutional protection of persons, with the Lockean and Jeffersonian and Augustinian view and Thomistic view that our rights come from God and are gifts into our humanity and are as much a part of us as the fingers on the ends of our hand. That would apply to me, to you, to George W. Bush, to Barack Obama, to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, to Richard Speck, to Al Capone, to anybody that the government wants to restrain for any reason.
Do you think that natural law is gaining ground or is receding?
Amongst people who are concerned with the government, amongst people who have come to realize that we have rights that are integral to our humanity, it's gaining ground. Amongst young people, it's gaining ground. Amongst the liberty movement, it's gaining ground. Amongst reasons, viewers, listeners and readers, it is gaining ground. In the government, it is not. The other day at Fox, I asked Congressman Jim Clyburn, the #3 ranking Democrat in the House, Congressman Clyburn, where in the Constitution is the government authorized to regulate health care? And he said to me, Judge, most of what we do is not authorized by the Constitution. Where is it prohibited to the government to regulate health care? He has turned, in his own mind, turned the notion of limited government on its head, and believes that the Congress can do anything it wants unless it's specifically prohibited in the Constitution. But the concept of natural law, articulated in the Declaration of Independence, codified in the Bill of Rights, is the opposite of that. And that is, Congress may only do what the Constitution authorizes it to do. And there are areas of human behavior where Congress may not regulate, no matter what the good there may be that could come from its proposed regulation.
Let's talk about a place, another lie that speaks to this. Congress shall make no law abridging free speech. This is arguably the most important right.
It is.
And what are the ways in which, when you look around the world today, or look around America today, we have much more access to many more materials. Is censorship, is abridgment of free speech an issue, and in what way?
Look, free speech was just saved by 3 black-robed judges in this city earlier this week when the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit ruled that the Federal Communications Commission cannot regulate the Internet. They really wanted to make sure that there was the fairness doctrine on the Internet. I mean, if anything is the free marketplace of ideas today, it is the Internet. But this goes way back, Nick. I mean, think about it. The same generation, in some instances the same human beings who wrote Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, also wrote the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize everybody in the government except the vice president, because it happened to be Jefferson at the time. Congressman Matthew Lyon of Vermont, if anybody is from New Orleans, Chicago, or New Jersey, they'll appreciate this story. Congressman Lyon from Vermont was prosecuted for criticizing the president, John Adams, for being too involved in the pomp and circumstance of the office. But the most offending thing he said was, and John Adams had a little problem with his waistline, he referred to the president as his rotundity. Here's the New Orleans, Chicago, New Jersey angle. Lyons was reelected to Congress from his jail cell because people were so outraged at this prosecution. But think of it. We fought a war against a king and a parliament 3,000 miles away because they assaulted speech. We became a country and we began to assault speech. Lincoln locked people up for what they said. Woodrow Wilson locked people up for what they said. FDR locked people up for what they said. George W. Bush locked people up for what they said. So what part of shall make no law does the Congress not understand?
Who did George Bush lock up for what he said?
2 librarians in Bridgeport, Connecticut, were served with a self-written search warrant authorized by the Patriot Act. That's where an FBI agent and his or her boss together write a search warrant without going to a judge, as the Fourth Amendment requires. The FBI agent shows up at this library. The librarian is 86 years old. He hands her the search warrant and says, "Don't tell anybody about it." She looks at him and says, "Who the hell are you?" He was young enough to be her grandson. She hands the search warrant to her assistant. That was considered speech, telling somebody else that she had received a self-written search warrant. The Patriot Act makes it a crime to tell anyone that you have received a self-written search warrant. You can't tell your spouse in the bedroom, your lawyer in her office, your priest in the confessional. You can't even tell a judge in a public courtroom under oath that you received it. This 86-year-old librarian told her 75-year-old assistant, and the government went after them.
President Obama yesterday vowed to move forward during his second term in office that officially started yesterday. Borrowing words from Abraham Lincoln during yesterday's speech, he said this:
"Through blood drawn by lash and blood drawn by sword, we learned that no union founded on the principles of liberty and equality could survive half slave and half free. We made ourselves anew and vowed to move forward together."
But President Obama and President Lincoln had very different views of that pesky thing called the Constitution. Here to explain is Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. We heard a lot. We heard the beginning of the Constitution 5 times yesterday.
We the people. Yeah. You know, if you like the president, if you believe in his vision of a federal government that can right any wrong and regulate any behavior and make everybody equal, then you celebrated the speech yesterday.
Sure.
But if you, like I think you and I, and probably most people watching us, believe that the Constitution not only constitutes, not only creates the government, it restrains the government.
Absolutely.
Then you didn't like what you heard yesterday. Yesterday was a very broad, expansive view of government. We can do this, we can do that. We can make schools safe, we can make the environment clean, we can get rid of the bad guys, we can make poor people rich. But nothing in there about freedom, about areas of human behavior immune from government interference. That's the whole theory behind the Constitution. That's why it's lasted for 230 years. Now, not every president likes it, and for many of them, it's an obstacle, and they find ways to get around it. It seems to be getting worse each time. This president is the champion at trying to get around the Constitution, including writing executive orders to do things that the Congress has declined to do.
Right, and Congress is already going to challenge him on that as soon as they can. We just got an email from James. He heard what we were promoting segment-wise for you, and he said, hey, Judge, the Constitution was written 250 years ago in a different age. Should it remain unchanged forever?
Well, James, in fact, as you probably know, it's been amended 28 times. And an amendment requires 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures to concur, meaning a grand national consensus to either change something huge, like get rid of slavery, or tweak it, like how many terms can the president serve. But it is the supreme law of the land. It is the basis for the government, and everybody in government, from a public school custodian to the president, swears an oath to uphold, protect, and defend it. Do they do that, or do they find ways around it? It depends on which side of the aisle you're on. I suggest to you that this president will try to find ways around it.
Well, let's see. Today is the official first full day of his second term.
What surprises are in store?
Yeah, there could be a bunch. Maybe not, though. All right.
All right.
Judge, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Stevie. Thank you.
Hey, things got heated during Hillary Clinton's exchange with Senator Ron Johnson yesterday of Wisconsin on the cause of those terror attacks in Benghazi. I'm joined by Fox News judicial senior analyst, Judge Napolitano. Judge, I find so much wrong with her remarks.
Yeah, well, her remarks,
in that case,
at first level, were callous, arrogant, and uncaring. But if you analyze a little deeper at her remarks, what is missing? Her job is to tell the truth. First of all, she's under oath. Secondly, someone who works for her, Susan Rice, the ambassador to the UN, went all over television, including with our own colleague Chris Wallace, and blatantly misrepresented the truth. I don't know if she lied, because I don't know if she knew that she was misrepresenting. Mrs. Clinton, the State Department, and the Obama administration don't care about the truth. For her to say, what difference does it make? The difference, whether it was a disorganized mob or an assault on that compound, and whether or not the truth was told, is of profound interest to the American people.
Your former job was getting to the truth.
Yes.
It's amazing. People are focused on the fact that she lost her temper, but they're not looking at the words in which she said. What difference does it make? The whole reason why we're there is because we don't know what happened still today.
You know, her losing her temper either wasn't a lost temper, it was either planned or it was controlled. And it served as a, to use one of your phrases, a brushback pitch, Brian. I mean, the Republicans did not examine her with enough aggression, with enough professionalism. They should have zeroed in with follow-up questions. They should have cross-examined her as if she was on the witness stand. The Democrats, as Bill O'Reilly said last night, not a single Democrat asked a single question that made any sense or that challenged her.
Here are at least direct statements. Tell me what you think of this from Senator McCain and Senator Rand Paul.
I categorically reject your answer to Senator Johnson about, well, we didn't ask these survivors who were flown to Ramstein the next day that this was not a spontaneous demonstration. To say that it's because an investigation was going on?
Had I been president at the time and I found that you did not read the cables from Benghazi, you did not read the cables from Ambassador Stevens, I would have relieved you of your post. I think it's inexcusable.
Those were two of the best statements made, along with Senator Johnson's question. What did she do with the statement from Senator McCain and the statement from Senator Paul? She didn't reply at all. And then they went on to the next question.
But her answer was interesting, and it was very easy. It took her 4 months. She had the answer. Her answer was, everything's addressed to me that comes into the State Department.
Right.
But I don't see every cable. It's not possible.
Right. It's too much for me to read. You know what? It's her job to know things. It's her job to execute properly. And it is her job to tell the truth, and for the people who work for her to tell the truth. Does she really think we believe that someone who works for her, Susan Rice, was chosen by someone unknown to her to go on national television, and someone also unknown to her gave Susan Rice untruthful statements to make, and she blindly made them? Does anybody really accept that? Does Mrs. Clinton think we will believe that?
Right.
Mrs. Clinton was under oath.
Right. And by the way, Chris Wallace's feelings must be hurt because she said, I don't really like doing the Sunday show.
Right.
That's too bad. That's too bad. Yeah, you just pick and choose what you like to do. Judge, always good to see you.
Wallace had a problem with her husband, not with her.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You sit there with that little smirk on your face. We remember that. All right, so Chris Wallace, we salute you. Judge, good job.
Not enough evidence. Let's talk to the judge. Judge Andrew Napolitano is here. He's our senior judicial analyst here at Fox News. You know, at the time, he said there wasn't enough evidence to prove anything. Well, usually the way this works is a grand jury, if it chooses to indict, then the prosecutors roll the dice, put it before a jury of your peers, bring all the evidence out you have it, let the jury decide.
Right, right. You know, this is a real head scratcher, and as we were talking during the break, Shep, I have not seen this in my career. Maybe this will happen in my personal career. Maybe this will happen once in a lifetime. That's how unusual it is, that a grand jury will indict someone for a crime involving death, a form of homicide, and the prosecutor will not prosecute. Normally, the prosecutor would not present evidence to the grand jury unless the prosecutor really believed that the people against whom the evidence was presented committed the crime, and that the prosecutor had enough evidence with which to obtain a conviction. You just wouldn't go to a grand jury with anything less than that. Now, he was under tremendous political pressure at the time. You remember that. I remember it. We all, those of us who covered it, do.
I feel like I lived in Boulder for a while.
Right. He may very well have just thrown all the evidence to the grand jury and said, you guys decide, hoping they would not indict, so he could use that as an excuse and politically move on with the rest of the work in his office and with his career. Instead, he got an indictment, didn't follow up on it, and he has the discretion not to follow up on it. I'm not suggesting he did anything wrong. It's a tremendous act of political and moral courage to say to a grand jury, you indicted, I'm not good enough for me, I'm not going to prosecute.
Well, that's how John Ramsey saw it. But I think that some who covered this case and others who watched it in the Boulder area and beyond would say John Ramsey is a very powerful man in that community, with a lot of ties in that community, that it's possible that the evidence, you couldn't tell exactly what happened for the evidence, but one of the theories was something bad happened to this child. Somebody covered it up.
Yes.
And the fear was that somebody might go to prison for something that didn't exactly happen the way they said. But whatever it was, you would think that justice would be able to play itself out.
Well, there's never been justice in this case. One of the grand jurors themselves, I don't know, male or female, broke the law by revealing what went on in the grand jury.
Can't believe it took this long.
And said, we don't know who did what, but we know they should have done something. Quite frankly, that's not enough on which to base an indictment. We don't know who did what, but somebody should have done something. On the other hand, we haven't seen the indictment. We probably never will. We haven't seen the transcript of what evidence was presented to the grand jury and what their deliberations were. We probably never will. It is presumably a valid indictment that the DA told us decided not to reveal to anybody, still not saying whether or not it ever existed, but one of his assistants said, former assistants, yes, it did exist. So it is a bizarre set of circumstances. Usually it's the other way around. Usually a DA is pushing a grand jury for an indictment and they're resisting, rather than what happened in this case.
Yeah, this was an unusual case, local weirdness, and what a period in our lives.
Maybe there's another surprise coming, Chef.
Remember those news conferences, and the Ramsey would shuttle people in and out.
Yes.
They coddled up to some reporters and wouldn't let anybody else in. The secrecy and the...
Yeah, some nut job confessed to this a few years ago. They locked him up for a week, and then they realized the confession was absurd, and they let him go. This case just keeps going on and on and on.
Unbelievable. Judge, thank you.
You're welcome.
Last week, Chicago mayor and former chief of staff to President Obama, Rahm Emanuel, sent an open letter to several big banks, pressuring them to cut off funds to firearm companies that don't actively get behind President Obama's gun control efforts. He says get on board, or these companies need to get on board, or Bank of America, TD Bank, and others should just cut them off. Today, a response from Texas Senator Ted Cruz. He has just sent a letter to the CEOs of several gun manufacturers and to the banks. The letter is full of fiery language. He writes in part, quote, "Should Mayor Emanuel's bullying campaign prove successful, I am confident that there are numerous financial institutions in Texas that would be eager to earn your business. And in the event that it might prove helpful, I would be happy to personally introduce you to their leaders." Well, Mayor Emanuel is not the only politician now getting attention for using high-pressure, strong-arm tactics in this gun debate that was supposed to involve a modest proposal that both sides could potentially agree upon. Meet Bill de Blasio. He's here in New York City. He's the man who wants to be the next mayor of New York, and he has been attacking investment firms here that have any dealings with the gun industry. If they invest in the gun industry, they're on his list. But can lawmakers legally appeal to banks and investors to cut off cash flow, to hurt businesses, simply to win a political argument, or because those gun manufacturers won't get on board with their political argument? Judge Andrew Napolitano is a Fox News senior judicial analyst. Judge, welcome back. I mean, I'll tell you, as somebody who practiced law for almost a decade, this is scary to me when you've got somebody who's got the power of government behind them, threatening private industry to cut off relationships with law-abiding entities. It is not like these people have committed any violation of law, even allegedly. They are following the law. It's just that Rahm Emanuel and this Bill de Blasio don't like their chosen business. So you've got the power of the government pressuring them to sever these relationships. My question to you is it even legal?
Well, the answer in a word is no, it's not legal, Megan, and there are a couple of clauses of the Constitution, some well-known, some not so well-known, that were written to prohibit this. One of the clauses is called the Contracts Clause, and it basically says that state governments or city or municipal governments that are formed in the states cannot interfere with contracts that are freely entered into, that were lawful at the time they were made. So because it is still lawful for gun manufacturers to manufacture guns, and it is still lawful for banks to lend money to the gun manufacturers, and still lawful for hedge funds to invest in gun manufacturers, it is unlawful for the government to interfere with that relationship. Now, this is not Rahm Emanuel as a private citizen.
That's right. That would be different.
Right, saying, I don't like what you're doing with your investment, so I'm going to take my investment out of yours. This is the mayor of the city's second largest city, of the country's second largest city, threatening to use the coercive power of the government to punish these corporations if they don't invest money as he wants them to, and, this brings us to another clause of the Constitution, if they don't speak out the way he wants them to speak.
That's the thing. That's where I want to go with this, because I realize, and there's another thing separate and apart from the Constitution, a civil claim called tortious interference with contract that he might be guilty of violating. I mean, you can't interfere with somebody's contractual relationship like that. But let me ask you about First Amendment speech, because viewpoint discrimination is not allowed when you have the federal government trying to say, you don't think like I think, I'm going to punish you.
Right.
That's not okay. Can Rahm Emanuel try to punish these gun manufacturers? Because what they say he's trying to punish them for is for not advocating the president's proposal. They don't see eye to eye with him on it, so he wants them punished.
Well, the First Amendment, and most school children can quote the words from it, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. The word Congress, since the Civil War and the Civil War amendments, means no government can make any law abridging the freedom of speech. The corollary of that is no government can force you to speak. You have a right to remain silent. You also have a right to speak out as you see fit. So for the government, the city of Chicago under Rahm Emanuel, or the city of New York if Bill de Blasio becomes mayor, to punish investment houses and banks and manufacturers because they don't say what these politicians want them to say is a blatant and direct violation of First Amendment rights, which are enjoyed by individuals, by investors, by corporations, by everybody and everything in the United States.
You think about how dangerous this is. Think if you had some very pro-life politician who is running around to apartment complexes saying, I'm not saying you can't rent to a woman who's had an abortion, but I'm going to give you the list of all the women who have visited Planned Parenthood on the days they provide abortions. And I strongly encourage you to reconsider doing business with women who have had abortions as the public official, as the mayor of Chicago. I strongly encourage it. I mean, can you imagine the outrage in this country, Judge?
Well, the left, of which Councilman de Blasio and Mayor Emanuel are prime examples, is only too willing to use the power of the government to enforce conformity with their wishes. They are no more interested in freedom than they are in jumping over the moon. They're interested in an end result, and they almost don't care how they get there. But your point is a great one. They don't realize that the power that they use today against law-abiding citizens who don't speak as they want them to speak could be used 5 years from now against law-abiding citizens who agree with them to force them to do things and say things that they don't believe in. This is why these clauses were written in the Constitution, to guarantee an area of human behavior, thought, speech, silence, commercial activity that should be immune from government interference and government bullying.
And because we know there is a difference between a private citizen speaking his or her mind and the power of someone who holds the office like Chicago mayor or potentially New York mayor doing it. They have a lot more authority and a lot more power to bully. That needs to be checked. Judge, thanks for being here.
Pleasure, Megan.
A potential scandal involving a U.S. senator is heating up in a big way after a late-night raid of a doctor's office in South Florida. That doctor, a friend and donor of the Democratic New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. FBI agents spent hours removing evidence from that doctor's office in West Palm. The reason really isn't officially clear, whether it's related to unpaid taxes or accusations the doctor gave improper benefits to the senator. Just minutes ago, Senator Menendez's office acknowledged that he did indeed travel on the doctor's private plane, but staffers insist that those trips were legal. Again, staffers insist those trips were legal. That doctor's name first came up in a report from a conservative website, The Daily Caller, back in November. It published an interview with hookers in the Dominican Republic who claimed Senator Menendez paid them for sex at the doctor's mansion in the Dominican Republic. The senator strongly denies those claims. Last night's raid also came just hours after a man in New Jersey pleaded guilty to giving the senator's campaign some $20,000 in illegal donations. The senator's office reports it gave that money to charity. Let's sort it all out with a judge. Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano is with us now. Once served on the New Jersey Superior Court as well. It looks like a lot of stuff piling up on Bob Menendez.
Well, it does look like a lot is piling up on the senator, and the laws are a little dicey. It is unlawful under U.S. federal law to travel to another country to have sex with someone under the age of 18, even if the sexual encounter there is lawful. Prostitution is lawful in the Dominican Republic, not with children under the age of 16. So age here is very important. Although, as you pointed out, Shep, the senator denies that he patronized prostitutes without even getting into the issue of their age. The other interesting things here are the travel on this plastic surgeon's private jet, which apparently occurred many times. The senator has visited this hotel 20 times in 2 years, the same hotel, a 5-star resort. The resort is owned by two sugar barons, two brothers. They grow many, many acres of sugar. Question: did the gifts from the plastic surgeon or the sugar barons influence any of the senator's votes? He did vote on sugar price supports. Maybe he was going to vote for the sugar price supports anyway. The other interesting thing is the involvement of the FBI. Now, the FBI could be looking at independent criminal behavior on the part of the physician who provided the air flights, or he could be looking at the senator. We don't know.
Wow. This one will go fast, I bet you.
I think it will. He could be removed from the Senate even if he's not convicted of a crime, because it's a lot of evidence to be convicted of a crime, very little evidence to be kicked out of the Senate for behavior embarrassing to the rest of the Senate.
We'll wait for the facts. Judge Napolitano, thank you.
Sure.
Washington constitutional icon Ron Paul understands the danger of government better than almost anybody else in Washington. He says the election on November 2nd
just about 3 weeks from now, is so crucial to the future of our republic. Congressman Ron Paul joins us now. Dr. Paul, it's a pleasure. Welcome. You have said that we may very well be on the verge of a revolution. Do you mean this in a good way or a bad way? Are horrible things about to happen or terrific things about to happen in the relationship between the government to individuals?
Well, I think the revolution is inevitable. I think we're in the early stages. I think it can be very good, and I work on the assumption that we can keep it good. But I do not believe the revolution will go without a lot of turmoil, because I'm expecting more financial trouble, a dollar breakdown, and a lot of bills that won't get paid. The checks are going to bounce. But on the positive side, the Tea Party movement and what's going on in the universities with the young people, the interest in Austrian economics, the interest in curtailing the power of the Fed, this is all very encouraging. And because of our traditions, I believe we can come out of this doing quite well. We just have to admit the fallacies of the system that we have. We have to admit that Keynesianism and socialism and welfareism and inflationism doesn't work. And once we do that, our solution is going to be relatively easy.
Aren't we sort of caught in a box? I mean, even if the Republicans take over the House and the Republicans, including perhaps your son Rand, take over the Senate. For example, the financial regulatory bill, the so-called Dodd-Frank bill that everybody abbreviates by calling it FinReg, that's essentially managed and essentially paid for by the Fed, by the Federal Reserve. So a Republican Congress couldn't even defund that if it wanted to, right?
No, I think that's irrelevant at this point, because we're not going to reverse it systematically. We're going to reverse it and replace what we have in a dramatic event. You are well aware of what's going on with nullification. Right. You know, they have a law out in California dealing with marijuana. Well, they've essentially nullified that, and it's going to continue. So there are going to be a lot of laws like this. And if the checks bounce, the states are going to assume responsibility for themselves, just as individuals will, and things will work out. But we need eventually, though, to have people in Washington that will restore and believe in these values of limited government, balanced budgets, honest money, and all these things that made America great. But no, I don't think Congress is going to change right after this election, and we're going to have a few more Republicans, and all of a sudden these these laws are going to be reversed. No, but the momentum then I think will go back in our direction. At least that's what I'm hoping for, and that's what I'm working for.
All right, you said that we may be on the verge of a Soviet-style collapse. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, basically the countries that it had subsumed before, during, and after World War II broke away and became separate and independent countries. Right. Some of them with tremendously free markets that became the engine of great prosperity. Do you think that some of the states of the United States of America might very well say to Washington, it's your problem, stay out, we don't want to have anything to do with you, we'll survive on our own?
We're going to have a lot of that, and that should get better. That's what we really have to work on. But what I'm referring to is the giving up of our empire. The Soviets literally gave up their empire, and we will. For financial reasons, we won't be allowed to have a presence in the Middle East. We won't be allowed to, and we won't be capable of paying for the troops in Japan and Germany and doing all these things. And that, to me, will be good. We will draw back, take care of ourselves, take care of our borders, take care of producing wealth here, bring the jobs back, get taxes down low, and balanced budgets, and that will be good. So yes, it will be reversed, but I do not foresee that the states will become independent, but more independent than they are now. They will not. They will have to give up the dependence on the federal government, and they will, because the federal government will be proven totally inept. They will have ruined our system. They will have ruined the welfare system. Unfortunately, they will have ruined the corporate welfare system as well as the foreign welfare system, and we should plan on that and see this as a good thing and a good opportunity for us to, you know, do something simplistic like, why don't we obey the Constitution?
Keep defending that Constitution and sound money, Congressman Paul. Thanks very much for joining us. Roosevelt, and I speak of Theodore, of course, and Wilson openly boasted that they were not obliged to follow the words of the Constitution, that as president, they could make changes on their own.
I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Judge Andrew Napolitano, whose latest book is Theodore and Woodrow, How Two American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom. Judge, thanks for talking with us.
Pleasure to be here, Nick.
In previous books, things like Lies the Government Told You, It Is Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong, and Dred Scott's Revenge, you looked at different eras of American history and the way that freedom was kind of eviscerated by various politicians and powers that be. Now you're talking about Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and the progressive era. Why does the progressive era matter so much when we're looking at shrinking of liberty?
The radical change in the relationship of the federal government to individual Americans was ratcheted up greatly in the progressive era. If we can go back a little bit, there was no relationship between the federal government and individual Americans until after the Civil War. And then the military occupation of half the country, known in some quarters as Reconstruction, resulted in a direct personal relationship between the federal government and individuals. During Reconstruction, for example, you couldn't go to the post office without permission from the military, and a lot of other draconian measures. You couldn't build a house or expand your house or repair your house if General Sherman burnt it down without permission from the federal government.
That was in the former Confederate states?
Yes. Yes. Now, in the progressive era, we find a Republican and a Democrat collaborating together, even though they barely met and didn't really like each other. The changes in that time period are radical, and they all center around one thing, and that is the Constitution somehow empowers the federal government to right any wrong, regulate any behavior, and tax any event, whether it's articulated in the Constitution, whether it can be extrapolated from the words of the Constitution or not. Roosevelt, and I speak of Theodore, of course, and Wilson openly boasted that they were not obliged to follow the words of the Constitution, that as president, they could make changes on their own. So you have two presidents who believe, this is a radical difference, Nick, from all of their predecessors, even Lincoln, that they can, from the White House, order and direct changes which will affect the lives of every American. Roosevelt started the FBI on his own, without any budgetary appropriation or legislation from the Congress. Roosevelt bought vast swaths of private property, or stole the property from the states because he didn't pay the states for it, and claimed this is now a federal land. He did all this without the consent or legislation from the Congress. Woodrow Wilson arrested people because of what they said about the World War I, not what they did about World War I, and his behavior was never checked. And they claimed they got the power to do this from their position as the head of a state, the head of a country, irrespective of the limiting factors in the Constitution.
Right, and one of the main theme of the book is that we either have a Constitution that is the law of the land or we don't.
Right.
And obviously the answer from Roosevelt and Wilson were, yeah, well, I'm the law.
Right.
So Roosevelt and Wilson, they're different parties. They come from different regions of the country when regional differences were much stronger.
Right.
You went to Woodrow Wilson, the college that he was president of.
Right.
He was a rabid racist.
Yes.
Theodore Roosevelt was a racialist in other ways. He believed in the supremacy of the so-called white races, which would preclude either, we would not have had membership in his understanding of the white race.
Correct. I would not have been admitted to Princeton if he were still president of it.
So where was their similar worldview coming from? Because they, and discuss the role of how they viewed elites.
They thought that they could uplift people's lives by telling them how to live their lives. So these two presidents and the government under them stole freedom of choice from individuals, poor as well as wealthy, and in return gave them a set of values and parameters in which they could live their lives, believing that this would uplift everybody's lives.
Are they wrong about that? Just on an empirical basis, because there were rapid increases in material circumstances for people. Certain types of diseases were eradicated.
There was great material prosperity in the progressive era. The argument of the book is it would have been vastly greater had the federal government not interfered. Neither of them would recognize the truism that government doesn't create wealth, it only consumes it. They believed that by redistributing wealth, they could spread the wealth. Of course, as we know from history, we are, as we tape this 2 days after the re-election of Barack Obama to the White House, as we know from history, the redistribution of wealth creates dependence on the people to whom it is redistributed. It doesn't incentivize them to create their own wealth. I've argued that the re-election of the president was in large measure due to the fact that nearly half the country receives most of its subsistence from the other half. Sort of Jefferson and Hamilton, the only thing they agreed on in public as far as we know. When the voters recognize that the public treasury has become a public trough, they will only send to Washington people who will promise to give them as much of the pie as they can. This began under Wilson and Roosevelt. Now, it's an odd combination. Roosevelt was born with a spoon in his mouth. Wilson was born to a middle-class family. But Wilson rose to wealth and personal prosperity through academia. Roosevelt, who never really worked the way you and I did, experienced wealth and enjoyed wealth that came from his family, and then the two of them sought political power. Neither of them ever had, excuse the phrase, to get their fingernails dirty. Right. Neither of them ever experienced participation in the risk of their own personal wealth in order to get a return on that investment. One was coddled by academia, the other was coddled by his own family, and both would meet at about the same time in the same place, which is the White House.
Who were other contemporaries of Roosevelt and Wilson who said, no, this is absolutely the wrong way to govern?
William Howard Taft is a real enigma because his presidency is filled with language and vetoes of legislation, which shows in his own mind a fidelity to the Constitution. And then, of course, William Howard Taft has the misfortune of running against Woodrow Wilson, right, where Teddy is running as a third-party candidate because the Republicans rejected him.
Right, and at this point, Taft, who had been a protege of Roosevelt, they're now bitter enemies.
They are bitter enemies, absolutely. Roosevelt believes that the presidency should be his. Taft believes that Roosevelt should stay in retirement. And Taft, of course, was not only Roosevelt's buddy, but he worked for him. So you have Roosevelt, who's now clearly going to take most of his votes away from Taft, facilitating the election of someone he claims to dislike even more, though on paper and in reality agrees with him, Woodrow Wilson. So the question is, because Taft ends up in a very nice position after all this. He's booted out of the White House. Where does he end up? As the Chief Justice of the United States, which is tremendous power because it's lifetime power. Was this a deal? Did he know he was going to get the Chief Justiceship when he sort of sacrificed his presidency so that TR could make the comeback effort and Wilson could get the presidency? One will never know. It is Wilson, of course, who makes Taft the Chief Justice. And then as the Chief Justice, he has this metamorphosis. He starts out as a small government libertarian and ends up justifying, through the typical circuitous route that the courts have done this for generations, all the big government legislation that the Congress enacted. In terms of those who would resist the progressive era, you have a cadre of members of the House of Representatives and senators from the Midwest, not from the two coasts, because progressivism is a hotbed in California, and clearly it is in the East Coast, and it is in Chicago, almost like the hotbeds of liberal Democrats today. Right. But you have a cadre of members of Congress from both parties and in both houses from the Midwest who meekly resist this. And then it becomes obvious to them, the longer they're there, the longer they see. What does dependency build? Votes. Right. And so they go on board to the point where today, Mitt Romney, supposedly faithful to the Constitution, can run for president saying, I'm going to maintain Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Amtrak, the post office, the long list of crazy entitlements that have bankrupted us.
And it's something like 49% of Americans live in households that get direct money from the government. Right. So this is the dependency.
Well, the tipping point is 50. I mean, once there are more of them than us, they will use the tools of the government, the legal tools of the government, to curb our liberty and extract wealth from us. I mean, to hear the president mock and belittle, for example, David and Charles Koch, each worth about $35 billion, forgetting that together they employ several 100,000 human beings. What does he want them to do? Take that $35 billion, it's $70 billion combined, and put it in a shoebox, and all those people will be out of work, and the government can take whatever it wants from the shoebox and give it away to those people who used to earn nice incomes themselves? You see, this is a problem.
What is the theory of social change? In your previous book, you were getting, it seemed more and more radical of saying, you know, there are times where we just have to say no to the government, and you were almost implying, you know, if not violent revolution, a refusal, a kind of Thoreau-like refusal to go along and to throw your body on the machine. Well, how do we change things, or how do you think we do?
You can't really throw your body on the machine when the machine has the majority behind it. I mean, we know, for example, sometimes the machine doesn't have the majority behind it. 2 days ago, we witnessed in Colorado, for example, a referendum on the ballot which legalized the possession of marijuana by adults for all purposes. This was after the legislature had defeated it. So this is literally the people going above the government they have supposedly elected to serve them, to work for them. So that's one way you can get around the machine. But at the same day this happened, Barack Obama amassed maybe 44 or 45% of the electorate behind his big government. The Constitution doesn't matter. I can give away all the wealth that I can get my hands on. So at some point this will collapse. At some point we'll be like Greece. Great portion of the populace dependent on the government, and the government unable to borrow money, and it knows it can't print anymore because you need a wheelbarrow to buy a loaf of bread, like the Weimar Republic. Where does that lead to? That leads either to dictatorship or to violence. And that will prove the wisdom. I'm not calling for a revolution. I don't want to get arrested by the feds as soon as I leave this room. But that will lead, that proves Jefferson's statement that the blood of patriots has to be sprinkled on the tree of revolution. He said once in every generation. We haven't had anything like this since the Civil War.
What are the ways to turn things around before it gets to, you know, before we tell everybody to go long and wheelbarrows?
Well, the Colorado example may be beneficial in unanticipated ways. It may demonstrate, and I'm not a crusader for marijuana. I am a crusader for personal freedom. I am a crusader for I can do what I want with my own body. I'm not talking about abortion because I believe that's another body inside a woman's, but that's another subject for later if you wish. But the marijuana one is a great example because the unforeseen consequence here, aside from telling the feds to take a hike, aside from the people of Colorado telling their own state government to take a hike, is the economic consequence. If Colorado succeeds, marijuana will be far less expensive in Colorado than it is today. That will dry up the demand for marijuana from the Mexican cartels. So this might be an experiment that would open up the eyes of governments in other states. Stated differently, if you were to take a poll amongst various interest groups in America, who wants to legalize marijuana? I dare say the group that most wants to do it? Law enforcement. Because they realize they're battling against a tide. This is against human nature. People are ultimately going to put in their bodies what they want. This is a waste of their resources. They're far better catching a bank robber than they are catching a user of marijuana. So social experiments at the state level may open up the eyes of the Victorian phonies and nanny staters around the country to realize that freedom produces more wealth and prosperity and happiness than government control does.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Your most recent book is Theodore and Woodrow, How Two American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom. I hope your book helps restore some constitutional freedom.
Always a pleasure, Nick. Thank you.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.
I'll say this plainly, I've said it before. Taxation is theft. It presumes that the government has a higher claim on our property than we do.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're very happy to be talking with Judge Andrew Napolitano, the host of the great Fox Business show Freedom Watch, as well as the author of the new book, It Is Dangerous to Be Right When Your Government Is Wrong. Judge Andrew Napolitano, thanks for talking to us.
Pleasure to be here, Nick. It's nice to have the opposite role of what you and I normally have. This time you're the inquisitor.
I am not sure which is more terrifying for me, but I can go with here. You know, a short history of some of the books that you've been turning out over the past few years include Constitutional Chaos. Then you have titles like To a Nation of Sheep, or rather, A Nation of Sheep, to Dred Scott's Revenge, to your current book, It Is Dangerous to Be Right When Your Government Is Wrong.
Don't forget the Constitution in Exile.
Oh, no, I know that,
as
well as Dred Scott's Revenge. But I mean, I sense in the arc of your titles more militancy. Do you feel that we're on a downward path irrevocably towards a loss of freedom and liberty?
I think we're on a downward path. I don't think it's irrevocable. And I have to give full credit for the title of this book to Voltaire, who actually suggested it to me one day. Of course, it's 250 years old, and a famous phrase from him, it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. Look, in one respect, women have full rights, and African Americans have full rights. It shouldn't be something we are happy about, but when you consider the historic treatment of African Americans and women, it's about time they have those rights. And as much as I love Jefferson, they didn't have them in that era. In that respect, we are a broader, more expansive, freer society. But with respect to the level of regulation by the government, the areas of human behavior utterly and totally dominated by the federal government, much less a state government, the surveillance state, the welfare state, the warfare state, the regulatory state, the administrative state, we are on a downward spiral, and we are losing liberty with every tick of the clock. And unless we get a game changer in the White House and the Congress, or on the courts, this spiral will continue.
One of your chapters has to do with the right to own property.
Yes.
You know, if we go back to the Kelo decision, which was, what, 2005?
Right.
You know, that was horrible, the Kelo decision, which basically the Supreme Court said, yeah, a state jurisdiction or a state political body can take whatever they want from a private property owner, immediately to turn it over to another private property owner, as eminent domain abuse, you know, defined. But that also sparked a counter force against eminent domain abuse. So, are we fighting the good fight, or you know, in these cases?
We are fighting the good fight. In fact, just 3 days ago, the good people of the state of Mississippi amended the state's constitution to prohibit any state government in Mississippi from doing what the Supreme Court authorized in Kelo. And of course, the Kelo case only got to the Supreme Court because the state of Connecticut did not have such a prohibition. But as much as I love the Fifth Amendment, which requires that if the government wants life, liberty, or property, it has to engage in due process, which prohibits torture and compelled testimony against oneself, it is the linchpin of big government. Here's why. Jefferson argued, and I believe, that the only moral, valid, lawful exchange of property is one that is truly voluntary. Hamilton wanted at the Constitutional Convention the same powers that the king did, which is the power to take any property, and the king would decide whether or not he owed you anything. They compromised with the Fifth Amendment, which is the government can take what it wants, but it's got to pay you a fair value for it, and the government has to use it for a public use. Jefferson warned that the public use would be whatever the government wanted its friends to have, and that's where we are. And it's because Jefferson's warnings were disregarded that the government can now take anything. So I ask in the book, do we really own anything? Can the government take that infamous leather jacket that you're now wearing? Answer, yes, it can.
I just
if
hope
it pays you the fair market value.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really not worth very much. So,
because it's yours,
no.
it's worth a fortune.
I was going to say it's even more. It's like a car, Judge. As soon as I walk out of the store with it, 50% off the value. Well, let's. You also talk, and I mean, you have a long list basically of all of the, all of our basic rights. The right to speech. There's no question that with, in any number of ways, the government at all levels is constantly trying to restrain and curtail our speech, political expression, things like that. By the same token, technologically, it's clear that we're able to express ourselves more freely and more effectively than ever. We saw this with, things like McCain-Feingold, in the attempt to use campaign finance laws in order to stop political speech. Forget about what the Supreme Court said in Citizens United. I mean, the fact is that people are now able to express themselves more freely. Do you buy that, and is that enough?
No, I don't buy it.
Okay.
2 FBI agents walk into a library in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and one of them has a self-written search warrant under his arm. I know this sounds like a joke. 2 guys walk into a bar, one has a duck under his arm, but it's true. And they serve a self-written, a search warrant, which under the Patriot Act they wrote for themselves and authorized themselves to the head librarian saying, we want to know what book so-and-so is taking out. And by the way, you can't tell anybody that we were here. The librarian is 86 years old. The FBI agents are in their early 30s. She says, who the hell are you? She hands the search warrant to her 75-year-old assistant. Fast forward 2 years later, they're in court because they talked about it. The latest trend in free speech violations is compelled speech. There's a sub rosa trend amongst prosecutors now to prosecute people for failing to report crimes that they have witnessed. And I will tell you, under the law, you have no obligation to report anything that you see except treason. There have only been 7 treason prosecutions in 230 years. The same First Amendment, which prohibits the Congress from infringing free speech, prohibits it from compelling speech. So prosecuting someone for not speaking, and then prosecuting someone for speaking truthfully, I got a search warrant from the FBI, what should I do about it, are egregious violations of the First Amendment.
You were talking about we need to get people in the courts, in the White House, and Congress. I mean, is this something that is going to be solved, or these infringements and incursions on our rights? Is that really going to be solved by politics, or how? Because isn't politics the problem?
Politics is the problem, Nick. It's a good question. When George W. Bush was elected in 2000, but put aside the manner of his election, I wrote about that and I was critical of the court. And the Republicans took over the Congress. Like a lot of libertarians, I rejoiced because I thought after these years of Bill Clinton, we'll finally get small government. Instead, we got a government that was less faithful to the Constitution than any government since Abraham Lincoln's years, because there's just a Republican version of big government. So when I say a game changer in the White House or the Congress or the courts, I'm talking about somebody like Ron Paul, someone who is utterly, totally, and without exception, faithful to the values of the primacy of the individual. The government must stay within the confines of the Constitution. So for Ron Paul to return us to that government would require half the Congress agreeing with him and half the Supreme Court agreeing with him. Do I expect that to happen miraculously in the next 13 months? I don't, but it could.
And I mean, you must take, I think a lot of people who believe in limited government and libertarian ideals, I mean, when you look at the popularity of Ron Paul, who those of us in the movement have been following him for decades, but right. I mean, over the past 5 years, he's emerged as, you know, one of the great national leaders of the debate, you know, in politics.
I like to think that Ron Paul is Barry Goldwater, and somewhere out there in the next generation is Ronald Reagan. There wasn't a Reagan revolution.
Yeah,
it didn't happen the way we
So you want
thought it
somebody
would
to
happen.
come after Ron Paul and completely subvert everything that he actually stood for?
No, I want somebody to come after Ron Paul and perfect it. Yeah. We thought Reagan would perfect it. We now know he didn't, for a variety of reasons we could talk about in another forum. But Ron has succeeded in moving into the mainstream debates over issues and institutions which are very serious, like the Federal Reserve.
Right.
20 years ago, the establishment didn't want to talk about the Federal Reserve. Now, even Democrats are saying, you know what, we need to know what's going on there.
Right.
And all because of Ron.
And also the Pentagon. I mean, he has really,
yes.
I mean, not since, you know, basically not since Eisenhower warned about a military-industrial complex do we have a guy who's actually, you know, putting that on the agenda.
Correct.
Let's talk about some of the dicier issues, or ones that separate libertarians among themselves. In your book, you talk about the right to own your own body, but then you're also very pro-life. You're anti-abortion.
I am.
So where does the right to own your own body stop, and where does the right to the infant or the fetus or the potential human life begin?
I believe, and it is a question of science and it is a question of faith, that a fertilized egg is a human being. It is the byproduct of copulation by 2 human beings. I'm not talking about some scientist in a Petri dish now. And it has a full human genome, and I accept that as a definition. Stated differently, it has all the chemical and biological makeup necessary to become human, to become a person as we understand it.
Now that's a
postnatal person with nourishment.
Fertilized egg that has been implanted in the uterine wall. Not just simply a fertilized egg.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. If we can't draw the line there, There is no intellectually acceptable place to draw the line other than the convenience of the mother. So when I say you have the right to own your own body, the fetus is not your body. People say it's easy for you to say that because you're not a woman. I am obviously not a woman. But I say it because of my fidelity to some basic libertarian virtues. The primacy of the individual. The individual is greater than the state. The state cannot, without the greatest violation of a moral law, authorize one human being to take the life of another.
Do you support the prosecution of doctors and nurses and medical personnel who perform abortions?
The answer is yes. However, we have not seen that because of the bizarre frequency with which abortion occurs.
What about women who have abortions performed, and let's say the men who drive them there as well? Should they be prosecuted?
Anyone who kills an innocent life, whether it's George W. Bush or somebody in a back alley, should be prosecuted for killing the innocent life. I'm not suggesting George W. Bush in this context with respect to abortions. I'm talking about other killings for other goals that he stated.
Where does this rank? I mean, because this seems like it should be at the very pinnacle of your...
It should, but it's not.
Yeah, so just explain a little bit about
that. I mean, if the government were in the streets randomly killing people, there would be riots in the streets to stop it. But because we have sterilized this murder, authorized it, legislated it, blessed it, if you will, lowercase b and blessed, there are no riots in the streets because the victims cannot speak for themselves, because they are totally dependent upon the perpetrator of the crime, because it happens in a sterile environment. There is not an outcry, as there should be.
Within the kind of broad base, I mean, you have thousands of people a year on your show. You talk to a lot of libertarian audiences. You're a crowd favorite. I mean, you are the rock star of Freedom Fest in Las Vegas every year. And other
it's only because you weren't there this year.
But how many people agree with you who call themselves libertarian, would you guess? And
I would say that about half of our libertarian colleagues are pro-life. And about half are not.
Well, and then you had mentioned that it's for you, it's a matter of science and of faith. One of the chapters in your book, which I think is wonderful, is you quote from the great play A Man for All Seasons, which is about Thomas More. Right. And you call it When the Devil Turned Round on You, which is a line about how you need to understand the state needs to be relatively powerless, because once it becomes powerful enough to do what you want, then it can turn on you. What's the role of faith? You are a practicing Catholic. A lot of libertarians seem hostile to religion or indifferent to religion. What's the role of your religious beliefs in your belief in individual dignity and rights?
I am not just a Catholic. I have to characterize this today because of what's been happening to the Catholic Church in the past 50 years. I am a pre-Vatican II Catholic. I am a traditionalist with a capital T. I am an Orthodox with a lowercase o, Roman Catholic. I know you're laughing because you and I have talked about this till we're blue in the face.
It's also because I'm mentally typing and shifting capital to lowercase.
Right. Well, I can't say uppercase O because then you're not Roman, then you're Eastern.
Yes.
Everything I do or say is filtered through my internal screen of Catholicism. I am thrilled beyond compare at the number of libertarians who carry rosary beads in their pockets. Think of the message of Jesus. The individual is greater than the state. I am here to save individuals in spite of the state. This is a libertarian message, if ever there was one. Doesn't mean you have to be Catholic. Doesn't mean you even have to believe in God. If you believe, as I do, that we were created in the image and likeness of God, then as God is perfectly free, we are perfectly free. If you believe that we are the highest result of some natural selection, then you also believe that that highest result, humanity, has free will and intellect to exercise that free will. Either origin, biological or theological, gets you to the point of the primacy of the individual over its artificial organization based on a monopoly of force, which we call the government.
Jesus is also remembered for saying, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's." How do you tell the difference? I mean, you talk a lot in your books consistently and in your show about natural law, higher law, Explain that for people who might not be familiar with it, and how does that help you decide, okay, well, Caesar has a legitimate claim on this, but not on this?
The natural law teaches, this is Aristotle, this is Aquinas, this is Thomas More, this is John Locke, this is Thomas Jefferson, this is Clarence Thomas, to some extent, Nino Scalia as well. I mean them no disrespect by calling them by their first names. Argument is that our rights come from our humanity, that my right to think as I wish and speak as I think and publish as I speak, to worship or not to worship, self-defense, privacy, my right to be left alone, are integral to my existence. I have them because I'm a human being. They don't come from the government. That's not an academic argument, because if these rights do come from the government, then the government by ordinary legislation or executive command can restrict those rights. If they come from my humanity, then the Fifth Amendment comes in. The government can only interfere with those rights, life, liberty, or property, with due process, meaning show me what I did wrong, prove it to a neutral jury, let me defend myself and challenge you, and give me the right to appeal. Basic due process.
But then also, it's not simply procedural due process, right? It's substantive,
It's
because
substantive
your book,
due
Dred Scott's
process.
Revenge, which is a fascinating history of race and law in America, I mean, you take issue with the Dred Scott decision.
Because some things are just plain wrong. Right. And to suggest that one class of people can enslave another class of people, not because of any culpability on the part of the enslaved class, but just by virtue of their place of origin or the color of their skin, violates substantive due process, which basically means the law has to be fair. It has to be, as Aquinas would have said and did say, a rule of right reason for the common good, not a rule of convenience for the good of some.
So where does taxation fit into that? So the income tax as opposed to excise taxes, because the federal government, before we had a personal income tax, most of their money came from tariffs and excise taxes. Are those moral and income tax immoral, or are both moral? Or
you're home at night and someone knocks on the door and you answer the door and there's a guy with a gun and the guy says, "Give me your money, I want to give it away in your name." Was this guy crazy? You call the police, you find out he's an IRS agent. So that's what taxation is. It is the government extracting money from you against your will to give it away in your name. I'll say this plainly, I've said it before. Taxation is theft. It presumes that the government has a higher claim on our property than we do. When the government imposed excise taxes, that was a user fee. You want to use the government's port. The government owns the water and owns the earth. It shouldn't, but it does. You have to pay for that right. So before the war between the states, the central government existed by user fees. It existed by selling government land. Government still owns, what, 88% of Nevada. That's a lot of land. And it also existed by imposing burdens on the states, financial burdens, for the services the central government performed. That's the way it was intended to be. After the 16th and 17th Amendments, the Senate is no longer representative of the states, and the feds can take a portion of your income tax. The feds take whatever they want. If those two amendments alone were to be repealed, the government would go back to the confines of the Constitution almost overnight.
Now, it's funny, you talked about the war between the states as opposed to the Civil War.
I don't want to get snarky.
I was going to ask now, here clearly, and you mentioned Lincoln in a negative way. Lincoln in many ways is the worst violator of the Constitution, when you run through what he did in order to prosecute the Civil War. The Confederate States of America, worse still, because they were fighting for the right to maintain slavery, right?
I believe that they were fighting for a right to secede from a central government, just as we seceded from Great Britain. They were also fighting for slavery, the worst abomination in the history of the world. But it is not the job of the United States of America to go around and looking for monsters to slay, which is what Lincoln did.
Yeah. So put yourself back in 1860, would you have joined an Abraham Lincoln Brigade, obviously named something different, at the time maybe a John Brown Brigade, to go in and help overthrow the Confederate States of America?
I think that slavery would have died a natural death here, as it did in Puerto Rico, in Brazil, in Portugal, and in Great Britain, and I think it was on the verge of doing that at the time Lincoln decided to start killing people.
In your book, you quote, I guess Thomas Paine, and then you said it goes back to Aquinas, but that we have a positive moral duty to disobey stupidity. Right. In the same chapter, you also talk about, and I'm quoting here, wise folks are buying guns and gold. Are you getting militant? Are we going to see? Are you going to be having Patty Hearst on your show anytime soon?
She's still
wearing
around.
a beret. But what are you getting at there? And at what point does the positive moral duty to disobey stupidity and to refuse to go along with laws that are immoral?
Well,
does that sanction violence against the state?
There's a potential for violence. I'm certainly not encouraging violence, but Aquinas taught us that an unjust law is no law at all. And the sit-ins at the lunch counters in the South in the 50s and 60s, these are courageous people who were using nonviolent means to resist and reject an unjust law, Jim Crow law. The Jim Crow laws compelled the lunch counter owner to segregate by sex, whether the lunch counter owner wanted to do it or not. The evil was the law. The evil was not the person behind the lunch counter. The Southern legislatures lacked the political will to change that. The Southern courts lacked the political and the intellectual will to change it. It was only a nonviolent refusal to obey an unjust law that changed it. That's what I'm talking about. Right. Bring it to today. We'll go back to our friends in the library in Bridgeport. The end of that story is a happy one, by the way, because on the eve of the trial of the, by then, 87-year-old librarian and her 77-year-old assistant, a federal judge said to the U.S. attorneys, "I'm about to declare the Patriot Act unconstitutional. Do you still want to go after these two ladies for discussing this warrant?" Suddenly, the case disappeared. Lately, another sub-rosa trend I'll tell you about. Federal agents serving self-written search warrants on, say, a person who owns a computer store wanting to know who bought a mobile phone or who bought a laptop. They're not complying with it. They're taking it to a lawyer and challenging it. And what are judges doing? Invalidating it. Is that a technical violation of the Patriot Act? Yes, it is. Does it result in a greater freedom? Yes, it does. Is it an example of violating an unjust law without obstructing a governmental function and without causing violence? Yes, it is. So that's what I'm talking about at the end. In terms of guns and gold, they are the only material things that will save us.
Talk about Occupy Wall Street real briefly, because they believe that they are protesting, in the name of a higher law, of righteousness. Where do you find them mistaken?
We sent some of our Freedom Watch producers down there to interact with them, and we were surprised at what we found. And this is a month ago now. I know this is changing by the minute. I believe it has since been taken over by the Democratic Party and professional activists. But before that happened, at least in the crowds that we interviewed in Lower Manhattan in late September, about a third of the people were wearing pins or carrying flags that said, "Don't tread on me." And of the demands of the crowd, and the Fed, and the wars, and the IRS, the Wall Street crowd was going along with the first two. Now, the lefties don't want to end the IRS. They want to use the IRS to steal more than it already steals. And the other day I was speaking at a group, and some of these folks showed up. I couldn't hear what they were saying because they were screaming so loud. I said, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." The crowd loved it, and they loved it. I welcome this controversy. I welcome this dispute. Obviously, I condemn the notion that the government should use its power to take from those who have and give to those who have not. But to the extent that this causes a debate about the fundamental role of government in our lives, it's a good one. The issue in New York is a bizarre one because it's private property dedicated to the public use by the force of law. It's a bad law. You should be able to invite and exclude whomever you want on your own private property. The city of New York does not permit that because the city of New York barely recognizes private property rights.
Well, I want to thank Judge Andrew Napolitano, the host of Freedom Watch on Fox Business, Monday through Friday. It's a great show, and also the author now, most recently, of It is Dangerous to Be Right When Your Government is Wrong. Judge, thanks very much for talking to Reason TV.
Thank you for coming on my show once a week. We love it.
I appreciate that very much. For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.